we are going to go to the submitted question and answer part, but we'll do introductions over again. My name is Thomas Pack. I am from UT Southwestern, and I'm part of the Medical Student Resident Committee at the ACAP. And then we'll go with Gabrielle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby. I'm a medical student at Michigan State University, and I'm the National Forum Moderator for PsychSIGN, which is the Psychiatry Student Interest Group Network.
And then we'll go with Dr. Alyssa Schaffner.
Hi, guys. I'm Alyssa. I'm a Rising Fellow at UTMB in Galveston, Texas. I am the MSR co-chair, so that's the Medical Student Resident Committee through ACAP, to try and get trainees opportunities to network and get involved in other aspects and projects and express interest in psychiatry, particularly child psychiatry. So welcome, guys.
And then we'll have the panelists quickly introduce themselves again, starting with Arya.
Hi there, I'm Arya. I'm a outgoing MS4 at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx. I graduate on Wednesday. And I am an incoming PGY1 at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C.
Josh.
Hi, everyone. My name's Josh. I am recently graduated, so I'm newly minted MD at finishing up my time at NYU and then going to UCSF.
Awesome. And Molly.
My name is Molly. I'm an MD PhD student at Oregon Health and Science University and will be starting at MGH McLean in the Physician Scientist Training Program.
Perfect. And we have about an hour left, a little less than an hour for the question and answers. We'll start with the submitted question and answers and then go with a live Q&A. So the first question that was submitted was about personal statements. How did you craft a personal statement that was authentic and reflective of your journey, but also allowed you to emphasize your passion for the field? Any and all tips would be appreciated.
I did something that I felt like was unusual compared to my peers, and that is I just wrote narrative essays around things that I cared about. I did not try to craft a personal statement. And once I found a story and an essay that I loved, I then edited in a way that it could be a personal statement. And I will add that I specifically included a school-specific paragraph at the end of every single personal statement, saying why I was interested in their program, who I wanted to work with in their program, and specific aspects of that program that I wanted to engage in as a trainee. And I think that was especially helpful in getting interviews.
And for context, Molly applied to research track, child track, and general track. And then Josh, any thoughts for a personal statement?
Yeah, so I started my first draft of my personal statement the day Roe v. Wade was overturned. So I was just kind of channeling a lot of, just rage at our country and the decisions they make into writing, which tends to help me out, actually, just being in an emotional state and just really self-reflective. And I think, it was a pretty good personal statement, it seems. Because I was interested in child, there was a lot of child-related things in my personal statement. My little anecdotes that I had thrown in there are all kind of related to some of my child and adolescent rotations. But also, I think the important thing is to really, before you even think of writing, just sit down, jot down notes of what are the things that you really care about that you want to convey to this person at a program who has to read hundreds, if not thousands of, applications, and you want yours to stand out. So really, you really need to have a good sense of who you are, what you've been through, what you're trying to do in psychiatry, or what are you interested in within psychiatry, and kind of craft and have that be your foundation for how you write your personal statement. So for me, I'm a person who's had a long journey, and so I made my personal statement really about like the journey and of how I got here, in terms of just my own like background, my immigrant background, first gen background, all those things you can like throw into your personal statement because it really gives the program or whoever is reading it a good sense of who you are like really quickly.
And Aria?
Yeah, I think that advice for crafting personal statements for psychiatry programs is different from advice that you'll get for crafting personal statements for other residency programs. I think that my personal statement looked very different than either my roommates who are applying to ophthalmology and anesthesiology. I think my interviews looked different than theirs did. And I think the bottom line is psychiatry programs really want to know who you are as a person. So as I mentioned in the pre-recorded session, I've known for a long time that I wanted to do psychiatry. I'd known for a long time that I wanted to do child and adolescent psychiatry. So I had already kind of had personal statements out there that I had written in the past. Even my undergrad personal statement, my med school personal statement, my NIH personal statement had paragraphs about why I wanted to be a psychiatrist in them, and then sort of like what experience I had pursued to sort of refine my interest in psychiatry. And I first started out sort of rephrasing that initial thing, that initial sort of, expanding on my CV that I had been submitting for years and years and years that had been good enough up until now. And the first time I submitted it to one of my letter writers because I was giving it to my letter writers when I was asking them for letters and asking them for feedback. I think that's also a really good way to sort of get your letter writers to know a little bit about you and how you want your application to be framed. My first letter writer was like, this isn't personal for a personal statement at all. They were like, I know nothing more about you than after reading your CV from reading this. So, how does this sort of reflect why we should accept you into our training program, our community? And so I really thought about that. So I volunteered in a psych unit when I was in high school, just sort of by chance. Actually, I went to like the hospital and they just put me as a volunteer in the psych unit, and that sort of from there was no turning back. And so I'd always started my personal statement with that moment. And I thought that was already a very early start. And like that explained everything you needed to know. But then I did some self-reflection on sort of why did it click so much then? What experiences had I had? Where did my interests lie? That sort of made that make so much sense to me at that point. And so I think like journaling, introspection, just sort of really reflecting on why you want to do this and what experiences, what parts of your identity led you to this path, is what you want to put in your personal statement. I think my personal statement is a little more vulnerable than most sort of written pieces that I usually put out there. But I think that it's important to be kind of vulnerable during this process because there's a lot at stake. These program directors are going to be entrusting you with their patients and they want to know who you are.
Yeah, and that's good for the follow-up question. Any one of you can answer about how do you talk about like discuss overcoming hardships and maybe even mental health concerns in your personal statement, or do you even include that, or identifying what to include with that?
So I did not include any mental health related things. I don't have any like formal diagnoses, but I was pretty vulnerable, I would say, in my personal statement, just talking about just particularly like my background and the importance of having people of color, particularly like Black people becoming psychiatrists, and why having like being at NYU and working at Bellevue, like most of the patients that you see at Bellevue are, disenfranchised in some way, low income, newly migrated, unhoused, etc. And there was this sort of connection I had with a lot of those patients because I could see myself in them. And oftentimes, particularly with like a bunch of the younger kids I was working with, they could see themselves in me. And so my personal statement like had, you know, aspects that reflected that vulnerability of connecting with marginalized people in that way.
Similarly, I didn't talk about anything mental health related. I did speak to dealing with the loss of my father in graduate school and how that affected decisions and my training process.
I also didn't talk about any of my personal mental health struggles. I did include anecdotes about family and peers and things like that that sort of influenced my path. But I think it's a little tricky to balance sort of self-disclosure with not disclosing anything that you wouldn't want to talk about it in an interview. I think that in the interviews themselves, you only have maybe 15-30 minutes with any specific interviewer. And if you're spending that talking about your own personal mental health struggles, then that's not necessarily like how you want to be using your time. But I think that it depends on how you frame it, and sort of how kind of like tactful you're able to talk about it. I think the last thing that you want is for anybody to think that you're going to be sort of impaired by your own mental health experiences because of countertransference, or, you know, things are going to hit too close to home, and you're not going to be able to provide for certain patients. I don't think that that's the case in most cases. I think that most psychiatrists are very understanding that people have mental health difficulties in their lives. But I think that, you know, it's always better to err on the side of caution. I think it's hard to sort of balance that if you do want to make it a focus of your personal statement.
And then I wanted to add also what Dr. Schaffner's put on the message. If it's in your application, is fair game for questions. So like in my personal statement, I talked about my family members with mental health issues. So that made it okay for like interviews to bring that up. But it was something that I was comfortable with, and that was something that was part of my journey. Going on to the next question, it's kind of a long question too, or a long response that would be necessitated, is sort of your process about the interviews and how any tips and strategies for that. And I think everyone could speak to that, so we could go with Arya.
Sorry, could you repeat the question one more time? I was reading the chat.
Oh yeah, no, like just tips, strategies for interviews, how did that interview process go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that overall that psych interview trail is wonderful. And I think that what I got from it was that any program that I wound up at would be a wonderful place to wind up at. The interviews really are just conversations for the most part. Of course, there are a few programs that will ask the behavioral questions, but I would say on, I don't know, 80% of my interviews, it was just kind of like, tell me about yourself, tell me about your path to psychiatry, and just sort of a conversation for half an hour with each person. I would say most of my places, they were long interview days, so it got kind of exhausting to say the same thing over and over. But I really think that just sort of being a person on the interview trail is sort of what they're looking for, because they're interviewing you for a job, but they're also interviewing you to be a part of their patient care team. So they want to know that you're a person who they would like to work with, and a person who, again, that they would trust with their patients. So I think that, you know, it's not usually a very high stress environment. It really is just sort of getting to know you on the interview trail, from my personal experience. Yeah, and you guys can expand on.
Yeah, Josh.
Yes, agreed. You will definitely have a very different interview experience than most of your classmates. On average, I was having 3-ish interviews a day that were all at least 20 minutes long. And for the most part, like everyone read my application like pretty thoroughly and like came in with like things they wanted to talk about. So like really know your application, because they might randomly ask you about something from undergrad that you thought was a really meaningful experience that you still kept in your ERAS application. And you might have to, like I did, go and dig up like what it is that you actually did. And particularly like if it was like research or something really important to you. But yes, agreed. Most of the interviews were conversational. What I did was either the night before, earlier in the interview cycle, it was like days before, and I was like prepping my responses a little bit more. But towards the middle and end, it was more like the night before, I would have my standard, I would have a Google Doc sheet with like, these are my standard talking points for all my interviews. And then I would also have specific highlights about that program that I liked from like my search of their website, like a day before, the night before, talking with people that I knew there, talking to like residents, and depending on when your interview day is, when your interview day is, you might have your interviews before they do their this is XYZ program and here's what we offer. And if that happens, you can jot down little notes of things that you may not have seen on the website, but you're like, oh, I actually would really like that. And it might come up during the interview as, you know, when you're talking about yourself or talking about what you're interested in, you can be like, and I know you all have this program. And so it kind of shows that you're like paying attention to the program, that you've done your research, that you like know about them and have taken the time to learn about them in the same way they've taken the time to learn about you by reading your application. That isn't always the case. Like you might still get people who have not read your application and like you're just kind of like, what do you want me to say when you say tell me about yourself? Like, did you not read my application? Because it's right there.
I will jump in. You will definitely be asked. Are you done? You're done. Yes, Josh?
Yes, I'm done.
Okay. You will definitely be asked, tell me about yourself. So have your 2 to 3 minute, like, who am I, ready to go? That's an easy thing to practice. I will give a shout out to Thomas, who did practice mock interviews with me at ACAP, which were so helpful and so valuable because I was pretty nervous about what I was getting into. And for those who are applying to the physician scientist training programs or research tracks, know that you have 2 days of interviews in your future. And you will also have an additional social hour, sometimes on a separate day, and they will also schedule lab interviews for you sporadically because people can't make it on the 2 days they've assigned. So I think I had ultimately 4 or 5 days for Duke because they were like, oh, this person we rescheduled, it's now here. You need to prepare for those like the research interviews like you would for working in a lab. You're interviewing to be in a lab. You're interviewing to be a postdoc. So you need to know the research. You need to know what projects you might want to work on. You need to know the lab publications. I had a similar Google sheet about everybody. So these are the folks I'm going to meet with. This is what they do. This is their clinical focus. This is their research focus. And I over prepare for things. So I read 2 to 3 papers for each person just so that I could, if they had a range of topics, so that I could speak fluently about any of those particular topics. The other thing I want to share that I didn't think about is that if you were on the West Coast, they do not think about you. And so some of my interviews started at 4 a.m. and they give everyone on the East Coast a lunch break. And you do not get a lunch break. So I was scheduled back to back for one of the programs and did not have a break to eat from 9 a.m. when they gave everyone on the East Coast a lunch break until 4 p.m. And I did not have food prepared. And so I actually got really sick. So look, if you don't get your schedules ahead of time and you're on the West Coast, make lunch and have it sitting next to you so that if you cannot stand up and eat, you are not sort of starving in the middle of trying to put your best foot forward. I know it's a silly thing, but it was a struggle with some of the program schedules.
Yeah, and thank you for the shout out, Molly. I recall PsychSIGN also actually sets up mock interviews. I volunteered for that last year, so that's something to keep an eye out for PsychSIGN. And then another follow-up question anyone can answer is just, should you put down if you want to pursue like a psych fellowship, like Jerry Psych? Should that be like brought up in personal statements / interviews? Resounding thumbs up.
Yes, but I would say the caveat is make sure that the program has that thing or has rotations or experiences in that thing. The only reason I'm saying that is because I think that it is conversational. They want to learn about you, but you should also go in knowing about the program. So if you say, I really want to get experience like with Jerry Psych, there are certain there's certain requirements, ACGME, that's the word I'm looking for, ACGME requirements for getting experience in different things. But if there is no unit that you can do Jerry Psych rotations on, if it's not an elective they have, I'm not saying they have to have a Jerry Psych fellowship to be able to get experience, but if it's something that they have no exposure to, saying that that's a big part of what you're looking for in a program is not going to necessarily sort of resound with that program. I would say the same thing for if you say like a big part of what I want to learn is I want to get a lot of psychotherapy background, and then you find out that they have very minimal psychotherapy training in their program. They don't require like any psychotherapy cases beyond what is required by ACGME. Or if you say, I really want to get involved in research in residency, and they don't have any funding for research. They don't have for research for residents. They don't have any research elective time. It's a community-based program that is not affiliated with an academic institution. Then that is not something that's going to sort of help your application. So I would say, yes, make it clear what you want to do. But if what you want to do does not align with that institution's mission, keep that in mind while you're interviewing with them.
I'm gonna pop in. Yes, be mindful of what you do include. For instance, I knew that I wanted to go into child, so I included that because one, if I went to a program that didn't have that fellowship, they were gonna lose me after year 3. And some programs really depend on their 4th year residents and some other things. So them knowing ahead of time could very well have indicated that maybe this wasn't the best thing, for me to be at. The caveat being that if they don't have a super robust Jerry or forensic or whatever program, you can say that you have a little bit of an interest in it. You don't know where you'll end up kind of thing. But if you're really interested in that program and do want to go back to that area, you can always say, what if, this kind of project gets started or a new fellowship is opening here, or, really talking about that in the future question. And one that lets them know like, maybe they'll come here and they'll expand our program or whatever it may be. But yeah, if you start talking about how you love working with students and this and that, but it's a community-based program, just be mindful of that regard. But it is okay to include that you at least have an interest.
So there are many nuances to this and what you put in and how you frame it. And then another question was also on second look. If you did it, if you think it was important, did you feel like you had to stand out with the second looks? Anyone can speak if they've done it.
So I did one in-person second look. And generally how it's done, if there is a second look, I think, where we are now in regards to in-person stuff, I think those might be coming back. But I also think there's a big push in terms of like maintaining equity to not do too many in-person things. So second looks for residency programs or like second looks for medical school, it's these set dates where applicants who are interested in the program can come to the medical campus or wherever they are, meet some of the fellow residents, meet some of the attendings. What is always done though is anyone who's involved in the actual ranking list, so the APD and PD is not there. And just for fairness, also, they usually don't schedule them until after rank lists have been submitted. So as not to introduce any bias. And so that's what Columbia did when I went, was they, the APD and PD, no one involved in the actual ranking process was there. None of the residents who were there had any involvement in it either. So it was an opportunity for people to ask stuff. Obviously, you don't, act stupid and or say something that's really stupid, or like someone could easily see as like being offensive or weird, because that they still might go back to their program director and like say, he made this comment to me. But for the most part, if like you're a sociable person, you got the interview, so they already like you. So by the time you're at doing a second look, it's more of like, do you like the program?
Yeah, I only had one in-person second look. I think there was one or two online meet the residents things afterwards, if I remember. I don't know, all of interview season's a blur, but I do remember the one in-person second look. And I absolutely loved it. I wound up ranking that program first, and I think a lot of that is because I did the second look and got to meet the residents in person. I think that a lot of programs are being discouraged from doing second looks because it's not really equitable, because the people who can afford to go, the second look that I went to was in New York, so it was easy for me to go to, but the people who are not going to shell out the airfare and hotel bill and all of that to go to the second look, even though they're not supposed to be disadvantaged by it, like there's always that chance that, because programs' rank lists currently are due the same day that ours are. So even if they say their rank list is locked by the second look, if the purpose of the second look is to help us make their decision, theoretically something can happen during the second look that could help the program make their decision. Even if the program director doesn't know that you went to the second look or not, let's say you're sending a letter of intent and you tell them that you went to the second look, then they'll know. I mean, I think that it's really hard to fully blind it. And like I said, I think that it did bias my view of the one program that I went to a second look for, because it was the only program where I got to talk to residents in person, tour the hospital, sort of really get a feel for the program and really visualize myself there. So I will say that I enjoyed going to the second look, but I don't know if it helped my decision necessarily, because it made my decision, but I don't know if it was necessarily based on sort of what the right decision was. It was just based on, I was so excited to see a program in person, I think. But yeah, I think that a lot of programs are moving away from doing second looks. I know that when we had our graduation survey, they said something about maybe trying to stagger when the program's rank lists were due with when applicants' rank lists were due, so that they could do second looks after programs have submitted their list, but before applicants have. I don't know if that'll be implemented by this year. But yeah, I only had one. So yeah.
And I just want to, for people who cannot afford to fly all over the country and stay in a hotel, I did not go to any second looks because it would have been several $100s, and I still matched where I wanted to match. So I don't worry if that's an expense that you don't have a budget for.
If the interview day does not consist of interaction with residents, in my opinion, and this is an opinion, that's a red flag, because if they rely solely on second looks where everyone's on their best behavior and some of those other things, you want to be able to get the real deal without spending additional money, without taking additional time. Like you should know what you're getting into from the beginning.
Awesome. So now are some questions about applications and like letters of recommendations. This one, I'm not certain if any of us could really answer, but it's like, would it be acceptable to mention activities and MSPE noteworthy characteristics that were not listed in my ERAS activity list especially now that's limited to 10 activities. Any thoughts about that?
I think that would be fine. I mean, it's noteworthy characteristics. You write them, you get 3. I actually think that would be a great way to, if there's something that you don't want to expand on as much, but you want to highlight it, I think that's a great way to do it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the noteworthy characteristics are really where you share personal characteristics that you might not have elsewhere in your application, or you reframe parts of your application, I think. So like for one of my noteworthy characteristics, I kind of like bundled together a bunch of activities and said like Aria is really interested in blah, 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 like, or she shows commitment to blah, blah, blah. But I know other people talk about, you know, if they have families, they talk about, you know, having children in medical school, they talk about sort of whatever is core to who they are as a person, even if it might not be elsewhere in the application.
And then questions about letter of recommendations. One was, do you think fellows would be okay as letter of recommendations? And the second part is it okay for me to have letters of recommendations from other specialties? So any comments or thoughts?
It's recommended that you have a letter of recommendation from another specialty. Specifically, they want to see, a lot of programs want to see letters from a medical specialty, either internal medicine, pediatrics, or family medicine. So there's a great residency navigator guide, and that is not the right title. I will look it up and put the link in the chat for everyone, that talks about sub-Is you should consider during your 3rd and 4th year when applying to psychiatry, and letters that are going to sort of be the most helpful to submit with your applications.
Every program has a different requirement. So using those kind of resources that Molly's going to be sharing, things like that, are really helpful. Some programs only need 1 psych letter, some prefer/require 2, some require a dean's or a chair letter. Every program is different. If you have an interest in child psych, having a pediatric letter is great. It doesn't have to happen that way. It's okay to accumulate letters as well, because you can assign which letters go to each program.
Yeah, I will say that of the 50 something programs I applied to, I meticulously went through and saw which letters were required, because I didn't want to waste my money on applications if I was going to be just rejected because I didn't have the right letters. Of all of those programs, I covered all my bases with having at least 1 primary care letter. So like Molly was saying, that could be pediatrics, internal medicine, family medicine. One even said like OBGYN could be considered primary care. And so 1 letter from somebody who saw you in a primary care setting providing clinical care, because again, in any psychiatry residency, 6 months of your intern year is going to be internal medicine. So you need to be a primary care doctor also. And then the most I saw was 2 required psychiatry letters from a clinical psychiatrist who saw you in a clinical setting. So most only require 1. Some don't have any requirements, but the most I saw is 2 psychiatry letters from a clinical setting. So even if you have, let's say, a research mentor, you want somebody who's seen you work clinically. Yeah.
I'll also add for letters of recommendation, because I think we didn't get a chance to touch on it. Yeah, letters must be from faculty, but some things might happen that you didn't expect to happen. So like you might get your letter writer who's like, here, you tell me about yourself, but then write it yourself and I'll look it over and I'll sign off on it. That can happen. Other times, depending, especially if you're like on IM, or sometimes you're only with attending for a few hours a day for like a week and a half tops, you can still ask them for a letter of recommendation, but you might also want to loop in any of the fellows or residents you worked with so that they can give their personal opinion of you as well, because they were most likely the ones who worked with you the most. And so they'll probably like behind the scenes help craft that letter regardless, even though the faculty is the one who ultimately signs off on it at the end. And absolutely so important, you need to ask your letter writers if they can write you a strong letter of recommendation. I'm going to repeat that again, a strong letter of recommendation. So this means like that person, not necessarily, you know, that person can speak to your, you know, strengths and everything you're bringing to a program, because, you know, sometimes what might end up happening is like the letter writer might actually say something bad about you that you weren't expecting, or something that like might not be like bad per se, but in the eyes of a program would be like, maybe this isn't the person we want. So you really need to make sure anyone you're asking, you trust that they will write you a strong letter of recommendation. Emphasizing that because some of my interviewers actually brought up my letters. Like they brought up how well people spoke about me in my letters. So like it's important that you, when you're figuring out who you decide to ask.
I'm going to jump in because I want to highlight a couple of things that have been flying by in the chat. I sent my personal statement, I sent my CV to my letter writers, and I also sent a little blurb about this is when the time frame that we worked together. These are some of the shared experiences or shared patients. I appreciated your advising on this topic so that if they were writing it later, they still remembered who I was and what we had done. And I asked for letters on my sub-Is. I knew I was going to need a letter. And so I was really clear up front. You know, I'm going to be asking for a letter of recommendation. Please give me feedback. Let me know how I can improve and grow across this month so that I can have that strong letter of recommendation. And then I checked in every week. I'd love to get feedback, respond to that feedback. The other piece is if you are applying for research track programs, one of those letters will need to be from a research mentor. And if you're in a program like an MD PhD program and you're like, but I want to have my program director who's known me for 8 years say something, and I don't have space. Recognize that for the research letters, they can be combined with MD PhD program directors. So I actually had a combined letter from my PhD mentor with my MD PhD program director, and I think that was really helpful.
Yeah, that actually is a really good idea. I didn't do that for mine as an MSCP applicant. So there are some questions about the number of letters. Normally, some programs will ask for 3, some will ask for 4. It just varies. There was also a question about standardized letters of recommendation. That hasn't been official yet. The thought, I'm looking it up, it's ADMSEP has this position statement, and they're going to be voting on it. So it'll be kind of interesting if, it doesn't seem, I guess not quoting on me, but it's still not decided on that about having a standardized letter. If anyone else has other insights about that, please feel free to chime in.
From my talk with various program directors, they're not too keen on that because it loses the personal narrative. So, and like the day-to-day that you want to know what it's like working with this person. So having that anecdote is important. So it's definitely a mixed bag, but by and large, people kind of don't really like that. That's kind of why chair letters and stuff are not as popular, is they're not personalized. So just be mindful of the requirements for this year.
Mm-hmm. And then when to get your letters of recommendation. I mean, I'll just, correct me if I'm wrong, but like you, as soon as you're like, it's publicly available. Oh, go on.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I said ASAP, as soon as possible, but continue, Thomas.
Yeah, but I think like the absolute latest you want your letters of recommendation by is by the time like your application should be in. So that should be like the latest, but you should have it much earlier. You should get as soon as possible.
I gave everyone a deadline that was 2 weeks ahead of when I needed to submit ERAS, and I did not tell them the real deadline. I told them that that was the deadline. And the reason I did this, or the reason is, and I didn't realize this until the first letter came in, but the letter does not immediately populate to your application. It goes through this portal. and it can take up to 3 days before it shows up in your application. Once it shows up in your application, it's still not assigned to schools because some schools need 3 letters, some schools need 4 letters. So you're going through and assigning these letters to schools one at a time. So this is not something where at the last minute, the letter goes in and it's fine because the application is going to take care of everything. You need like 3 to 4 days for that to go through the portal to ERAS system and then for you to make those assignments. So keep that in your head. Faculty, you know, I sometimes, if depending on how well you know them, you can ask how they feel about nudging emails. I sent them, I'm from New York, so it was like, this is happening, you have to turn this in. But be prepared to nudge if that deadline is getting close, because you need that to get you need to have that to have your complete application for interviews.
Yeah, I don't mean to be dramatic, but I think the last 2 weeks of September this year were the most stressful weeks of my life, specifically because I was nudging faculty who I was asking for letters of recommendation to upload my freaking letter already. And the problem is that faculty are busy, and especially around application season, faculty are busy, especially if they're involved in the application process at all. So, you know, I had people who I'd asked for letters months in advance who had been putting it off, still not have their letters uploaded by the week it was due. I had faculty email me saying, oh, I'm not going to be able to get my letter in by then. Is it okay if I upload in mid-October? And having to be like, no. Like, but in those cases were the times where, so like I said before, I wound up getting a bunch of extra letters because I was really panicking at the end. So I had some last minute letters that I could just upload and assign to those schools that needed 4 letters or needed a specific letter that I wasn't sure I was going to have in on time. Because the thing is that a lot of programs will not look at your application until it's complete on their end. And that includes having the required number of letters that they're looking at. And really, you know, at the end of the day, you want to get your application looked at before all the interview spots are gone. So if your letter isn't uploaded before all the interview spots are gone, then your shot at getting an interview is much lower. So I think that, you know, it really is kind of a nudging game. Depends again on the personality of who you're asking for, but don't be afraid to nudge people. Don't be afraid to ask for letters. Also, I know somebody was asking about that. It's going to be awkward, but I think that most attendings know that if they are working with a 4th-year medical student on any given rotation, there is a good likelihood they're going to be asked for a letter of recommendation at the end of that rotation. So they're expecting it. Some are more overwhelmed about it than others, but you know, it never hurts to ask. And at the end of the day, it's what you need for your application to be read. And if at the end of the day, all of your hard work, all of these years goes to waste because somebody didn't upload their letter, then, you know, it's worth that extra nudge email.
In regard to the letters, don't stress out in like June, July, but if they're not done in August, that's when you start stressing. Give the letter writers at least 6 to 8 weeks, because hey, you know what? It's busy. Residents are onboarding in July. They're working with people. So there is a lot of change and adjustment. And you want them to really have time to write the letter and it not just be a canned response. Stroking an ego in regard to, I really enjoyed working with you and this experience was really powerful and this and that. That is a good way to start the introduction to getting a letter. It's a little less awkward that way.
And we're running on our like approximately 10 minutes left. So we'll just continue going on with the questions. So there are some questions about away rotations, which we answered earlier. And I'll just recap that it's nice to have an away rotation, but it's not necessary. None of our panelists did an away rotation. Interest in specific programs and geographic locations. That actually is something good, because how do you stand out when you're applying to, when you're hoping to go to a regional location other than where your med school is located, or like if it's not a part of your geographic preference signaling, is that something worth applying, or what can you do to like stand out? for those programs that are like outside your kind of geographic region. Anyone can message about that.
I think I applied to places that I lived or where I had family. So for the most part, I could sort of make an argument that, or that had a really strong research draw for me. So I think the other piece, if it's not geographically a match, you can certainly talk about something specific and absolutely unique about that program. And the place to do that is going to be, I think, in your personal statement, because you may not have a signal or a geographical signal to use to highlight that.
I think also within your geographic signals, you get, I don't remember how many characters it was. You get about a sentence to explain why you're signaling that geographic region. I think that what you say there, if it's a region outside of where you are, does matter. I think that like the example I think too is like Pittsburgh. I know they're in the same geographic region technically as New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, or something like, or no, Connecticut's Northeast, but New York and New Jersey and Philadelphia are all in the same geographic region technically. But so is Pittsburgh. So when people signal that geographic region and talk about how much they want to be in New York, they don't necessarily get the Pittsburgh interview. You know what I'm saying? So if you want to go to the West Coast and you've never been to the West Coast before, what you say in that one sentence about why you want to be in the West Coast can make a difference. For instance, if you say, I have family there, I have a significant other there, versus if you say like, I want to go to the beach all the time. You know, I think that that makes a difference in making you stand out.
The next part kind of goes into a little bit of red flags, if you can talk to that. Some people know that they failed their psych shelf exam or they failed their IM clerkship. Like, how much of a deal breaker is that? What can they do to like compensate for that or talk about it? If any of you are comfortable talking about how to approach that.
Don't shy away from it. They can see it on your application. So it's a lot more powerful when you bring it up and talk about what you learned from that experience or how you grew from it, shaped who you are, why you apply this. Use it as a powerful learning tool. I was very vulnerable in my whole application process and my testing and things along those lines, and really used that. And for those who have a non-traditional path or a gap or anything like that, so I delayed step one. So I talked about how I had that gap and what I learned and how I grew and stuff during that time. So it's okay to bring it up. And a lot of people actually appreciate that because it's probably going to be asked anyway. And so at least you're being open and honest and forthcoming. And then don't be afraid to say, like, this was a difficult time. Again, psych is such a unique specialty anyway that they want to hear the narrative. We want to hear who you are, and really focus on the humanity aspect. Numbers, step scores, passing, shelves, all of that. It's a formality and a filter for some programs, but we like, I'm the one interviewing, programs really want to know the real you, which is why they gave you an interview in the first place, because they have all of this data in your application. But who you are and what you can add to their program, whether that's from a prior trial tribulation, can be very powerful.
I want to jump in quickly. I was a non-traditional student. I had a lot of different pre-med classes because some of them expired, and I needed to go to a cheaper school. And so I was sort of all over the place, and I didn't realize how strange that looked on my application. And so know that you can actually download the ERES application that's like the CV version, and then you can download the application version that they see, which I learned too late, because I kept getting questions about why I had all of these different, like why I had 5 different programs for undergraduate courses. And I didn't know why that kept coming up. I didn't think of it as a red flag. And it wasn't until someone pointed out how strange it looked on the printed application that I realized I need to address this quickly and upfront so that we can move on and talk about things that are relevant to me as a future resident.
I'll also add that sometimes things that you think are red flags aren't really a red flag to a program. So you like just have just like the awareness of the situation to know like, okay, I'm concerned about, you know, how that I had to remediate a course or whatever. If they don't bring it up, and it's probably not an issue for them, so you don't need to bring it up and you don't need to worry about it as much. You know, if you're concerned that you didn't, I was concerned because I didn't honors psych, that was gonna affect me in some way. It did not. So stuff like that. If you're concerned about something that on your application that you think is gonna hold you back, and you're going through the interview cycle and you're fine, like no one's really bringing it up, no one really cares, it's okay to just not talk about it at all and just talk about the stuff that you do want to talk about in that interview. Because like, you know, wasting 2 or 3 minutes on explaining why, you know, you had to retake a rotation, and when you could be talking about, you know, all the things you love outside of psychiatry or something, so they can get to know you better, choose the latter. Like they're, yeah.
Yeah, I think that like I mentioned in the chat before, I think the things that they want to talk about on interviews are not necessarily the things that you you came prepared to talk about or that you wanted to talk about. As I mentioned, I came into interview season, I had like a small research background. Like I don't have like a lot of research, but you know, I was prepared to talk about my research and nobody wanted to talk about my research. They wanted to talk about like, I just got like a yoga teacher certification and they wanted to talk about yoga, or they wanted to talk about like what books I've read. Cause I wrote that I like to read in my hobbies. I think the hobbies come up a lot. So I think just like be prepared to sort of talk about what you're not prepared to talk about. And you'll be surprised what things you can connect with interviewers over.
And then we're coming at the end of the session. Gabriel or Gabby, do you think any good last ending question that we should use?
We've had quite a few come through, but they're pretty specific. I think your suggestion of earlier of just kind of some parting advice, perhaps would be a good way to end.
Okay. So we'll do that and we'll start with Molly and then circle back, or about just like last parting advice. Or we could just go with Arya first if you, okay.
I think that really parting advice is that you've already done so much work to get to the point of the application. All of the work is already there. You're just presenting it to people. And at this point in the process, we really don't have that much control, which I think is really hard for us as med students to kind of grasp. But all you can do at this point is kind of put out your best application and enjoy the ride. Application season is a lot of fun because you finally get to interact with the people who you're going to be working with. I think it really confirmed that I chose the right field, that I want to be a psychiatrist. I love other psychiatrists. People are great on the interview trail. But I think at the end of the day, there's not that much you can do. So you might as well just enjoy it.
Could go with Josh.
So my parting advice is you are worthy of every second of this experience. You're worthy of every interview you get. You're worthy of wherever you match up. And even if you don't match or something crazy happens, you are still worthy, and you are still enough. The process, I didn't understand it being on the other side and seeing my MS4 friends go through it and how they were freaked out and how they weren't sure if they were going to match and all this stuff. And now having gone through it, I get it now. And I think like one of the things is that existential, sunken cost fallacy of feeling like if this doesn't happen, everything that's happened up to this point wasn't worth it. And that's not true at all.
I would add, it takes more time to interview than you think it will. And so give yourself time and space to decompress and to be human and to recover and to take care of yourself. I didn't try to do any clinical rotations while I was interviewing because I could do research instead. And so try to build in rotations where you can take the time you need, not just to interview, but to take care of yourself as part of the process of interviewing.
Thank you so much, panelists. That was very powerful. It seems like you're making some of the attendees tear up too. So with that, we'll conclude our session. Thank you again for the panelists for taking your time to talk to all of us. Thank you so much, PsychSIGN Gabrielle, for coordinating all of this too. And also Dr. Alyssa Schaffner from the MSR committee, and also Annika, who is our person behind the scenes who also helped coordinate this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and if you have any follow-up questions, I know we shared our emails earlier, feel free to reach out to me offline if there's anything specific I can help anybody with.